tie up another wet fly from Ray Bergman's book on trout today. This is the light fox. It's a simple, basic little wet fly. The tail is made out of some yellow yarn and the body is some white yarn. I like this because I think this is going to be a nice little baitfish pattern. I imagine it might even go with as a drowned insect. I don't know what, being so bright, but I think it'd be a nice little baitfish pattern. Later on in the summer and this fall, it tends to be streamer season around here in the Midwest, and I think that this might be an interesting fly to swing during that time. Don't know much about the history on this. It is mentioned in Ray Bergman's Trout, as I mentioned, but I couldn't find much of anything else about the origins of this fly. But that is the light fox. I'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to start the light fox by placing my hook in the vise. This is a Mustad 3399 traditional wet fly hook. This is a size 6. I'll debarb the hook. My thread I'm starting with is a white thread. Because the body of this is a white yarn, even though it's not a floss, I could probably get away with a black thread because the yarn's going to be so thick. But I'm used to starting out with a white thread and then just changing it over. So I'm going to go ahead and stick with that. A little wax on my thread. I'm going to start the thread about an eye length behind the eye of the hook. Advance it down the hook shank to just between the point of the hook and the barb. This is where I'll tie in my tag. Tag is some gold tinsel. I'm going to use a Danville size 16 and 18 silver and gold tinsel. Correct myself there. I'm actually using a size 14 silver and gold tinsel for the tag because it's a little bit wider. I can just get it applied a little quicker. I'm going to use the 16 and 18 for the rib. I'll attach that to the side of the hook, put in a few wraps, turn the hook over, and then I can apply the tinsel with the gold side out for about 4 wraps down the hook shank, and then 4 wraps back up the hook shank to get my tip in. This should end with the very end of it right about the point of the hook, maybe a little bit behind. Tie in my tail. The tail on the light fox is just some yellow yarn. I've got some wool yarn here. This is about a 3-strand yarn. It's pretty thin, so I'm just going to use all of it. It's a little bit brighter yellow yarn than some that you find out there. It's not that mustard color, which in itself is good, but I want something a little bit brighter on this. So I'm going for more of a little baitfish pattern. The brighter colors on this, I'm going to stick with some brighter yellow. I'm going to trim this just a little bit beyond the bend of the hook. And that's because when I tease all of these fibers out, they'll actually shrink back just a little. So the end of that tail should be right even with the bend of the hook. I'm going to leave those just the way they are for right now. As I mentioned, the rib, I'm using a 16 and 18 gold Mylar tinsel. The reason is I think, size 6 is kind of an in-between, even a size 8 for me at least, an in-between wet fly hook in terms of the size 16 and 18. I think looks good in terms of the ribbing. If I go to a size 14, sometimes it can look a little crowded, like there's more to the rib than there is the body. Obviously, if I go down to, say, a size 8 or a 10, definitely I'm just going to stick with the smaller rib. If I go up to a 4, I'm going to go with the larger size 14. But that's what I'm using on this one for now. The body is just some white wool. This is some, it's a little bit brighter white. This is bleached out a little bit more. Natural wool is kind of an off-colored white. I'm going with, again, a little bit brighter colors on this. I want this to stand out just a little bit more. This is a 4-strand wool, and on this size hook, I'm just going to use all 4 strands. If I was doing this on a size 8, definitely a 10, I'd probably go with just the 3 strands, much smaller than that, just 2 strands. As you'll see, even all 4 of these, as we flatten it out, will give us a fairly chunky little body on this fly. Trim that yarn so that it's just the length of the body. Often when you tie the yarn in like this, as you bind it into the hook shank like this, it compresses it and kind of pushes it out and lengthens it, so you often have to trim a little bit back. Leave my thread about a hook length behind the eye of the hook, and I'll apply the yarn and the rib. The yarn I'm going to flatten out here, so I'm untwisting this so that all of these strands are pretty much straight and parallel. As you see, when I proceed to apply this, I'll overlap just a little bit, but I'm also flattening out all of those strands so that I get a smoother body. I don't want it really thick and chunky. As I said, you can tell even with the underbody here that this is pretty thick, and then add this to it, it definitely gives it a little bit thicker appearance. You have 5 evenly spaced wraps, or more or less evenly spaced wraps on the rib there. Again, when you're tying on this yarn, it's kind of hard because the rib can go down in between a couple of fibers and move one way or another. So getting that nice and smooth. Probably the only other way to do that would be to somehow brush out that yarn so it's a little bit flatter, maybe even dub it in. Now, I do have some of these that I've tied with a rib in the size 14, and you can compare that here. You can see the size 14 is just a little bit wider, definitely takes a little bit more of the body up, whereas the size 16 looks just more like simple segmentation. However, the size 14 is going to give you a little bit more flash, a little more glint in the body. So it's up to you, whatever you want to go with. Like I said, size 6 is kind of a in-between size in that regard. So now I'm going to change over my thread. To finish the fly, I'm going to use a Danville 6/0 in black. Put some wax on my thread. Now I'll tie in the throat. For the throat, I'm just using some yellow Schlappen. This is not really a darker yellow. Again, I don't want to go with that mustard kind of yellow. I'm just going to go with it's a little bit brighter, not a fluorescent. You could use a fluorescent if you had, say a real bright orange, or not orange, but yellow in the tail. But I'm going to go with just, it's not a standard, but, bright yellow. Get two slips together and get those underneath the hook. Tie in my throat, trim away the excess. Now I'm ready for the wing. The wing on the light fox is very simple. It's just a slate, is what Ray Bergman has in the book, which essentially means just kind of a gray, a natural gray, either mallard or goose quill. I'm going to go ahead and use a goose quill for this size hook. I'll get my left and my right clipped out of that. Get those together. I want to even the tips up. Make certain I have them nice and even, and then double check the width. A little bit extra, so I'll peel that out. One thing I wanted to show you is on your side, that slip looks just fine. But on my side, I've got a little bit of gap. There we go. I'll break that out there so you can see it. I've got just a little bit of a gap here where I have on one barb down there, I have the tip broken off. If I were framing these, I would probably go ahead and be a little more careful about that. If this was a gift to somebody or something like that, because this is a fishing fly, I'm not going to be concerned about it. The other thing is, if you are planning on framing this, keep in mind you could still get away with that if it's going to be on the back side of the frame. Now, I'm simply pointing it out because in this case, the way you're facing me, when I tie this in, that slip right here that has that little gap in it will be on my side. So generally, you're not going to see it from your view as I tie this in, but you will see it as I rotate the fly around. So I am pointing that out. But if you were going to frame this, I think it would be acceptable, depending on, the application, to go ahead and tie this in if that little slip were going to be on the back side, maybe. Position my wing. I want the tip of that to be almost down the end of the tail. 4 or 5 wraps to secure that in, and we'll take a look at it. It's a little on the short side, so I'm going to go a little bit longer. I want the tip to come back to about the bend of the hook. Remember, our tail's really short on this. Yeah, that definitely looks a little bit better. Although the length on those got off a little bit. Mine on my side's just a little bit longer. Again, if this were, tying this as a fishing fly, which is what I am, I generally wouldn't be that concerned about it. But I also like to show that you can reposition these things a few times, not a whole lot. As you're tying the flies, and you have an idea in mind of what you want it to look like, that's what you want to pursue. If it doesn't come out just perfect, a couple of choices. You can go with it as a fishing fly, and that's great. Tie another one, get it the way you want it. Otherwise, undo it, and then make certain you're getting it tied in the way you want it. They don't have to be perfect, especially for fishing, but at the same time, I think there's something to be said for striving for good results. So I'll trim away the excess on the wing, and I will bring my thread behind the eye of the hook, working backwards to create the head of the fly, securing all those butt ends in, smoothing that off. Now I will spin my bobbin counterclockwise, using the hook on my whip finish tool. I'll help to flatten that thread out. This just helps from the standpoint of giving the head a nice smooth appearance, and then when I put the lacquer on it, it will have less ridges and gaps to fill in. My whip finish in, trim away my thread. This is where I will take my bodkin and I'll tease out that tail. Sometimes you'll need to put your finger on the other side, because as you push in this, sometimes it can push away and you don't get your bodkin actually in the fibers. So if you put your finger on the other side like this and just use it as kind of a backstop, you can get that in there and tease those fibers out a little bit quicker. As you can see, some of that shortens up. I like to pull this out and just trim off any long fibers that come out, but that shortens up, so now my tail is just about the bend of the hook. My wing will come back just about to the length of that little tail, and we're all set. Little head cement on both sides. Oh, got enough out there for both of them. And then I'll put some black lacquer on that in just a moment. A couple of coats to finish off the light fox. So there you have it. Interesting little fly with the yarn body and the yarn tail. Simple little wet fly. If you're into learning how to do some wet flies, this would be a great little one to start. Inexpensive with the materials. You could even use an acrylic yarn if you want. I used a wool simply because that's what the original recipe called for. However, I imagine back in the day when this was tied that the wool was a little bit darker in shade, both the white and the yellow. I don't think they had really bright wools back then. I may be wrong. But I'm looking forward to fishing this, especially later on in the season and in the fall when the streamer bites on a little bit more. I think this is going to be a nice little bait fish imitation. So that's the light fox, and thank you for watching today.
Thanks for joining me at Devise today. I hope you learned at least a new pattern, if not a new technique, maybe a tip or trick here and there. If you have any questions about this fly or any of the techniques used in constructing this pattern, please leave them in the comments section down below. If you go to the trouble to ask a question, I'll go to the trouble to answer it. If you'd like to help dressed irons, please share this video with your friends and anybody you think that might enjoy this pattern. Until next time, remember, it's fly tying. If you're not having fun, then you're doing it wrong.